Hello, I think that I am on. I'm really pleased to be here. My name is Gwen Marchand, and I will introduce myself in a moment. But I'm here today to talk with you about complexity science and the design and evaluation of behavior interventions. And before we get started, I just want to thank the BESP organizers for inviting me to the symposium. I'm very excited to be here and to share some of the ideas that I've been working on for the last few years. And I also have to provide a couple disclaimers. My voice is not entirely cooperating today, so I hope that I come through all right. And I also have some airplanes going by outside, so hopefully it's not too bad. Here at the university, we are in the flight path of the airport, so if you ever want to come to Las Vegas, just wave out your window and there's a good chance you'll be waving somewhere in my vicinity. And I sure do wish that we were in Finland right now, but I'm very happy to be joining you in this particular avenue. So let's get started. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so I thought I would spend a few minutes introducing myself and telling you a little bit about my orientation to this topic. So kind of my general orientation to work is that gray is okay. I like ambiguity, and it turns out that in order to be a researcher interested in new methods and complexity science, you have to be okay with spending a lot of time in gray areas where there are not necessarily clear answers for all of the questions that you want to ask. Professionally, I'll give my little spiel. I'm the Associate Dean for Research and Sponsored Projects at UNLV and the College of Education. I'm also an Associate Professor of Educational Psychology. I study, my topic areas are student motivation and engagement, classroom systems. I study collaborative and team processes. I do quite a bit of work on program evaluation using complex systems methods, and I also study school mobility. And one of the other somewhat surprising elements or pathways that I've taken is that I have a true focus and interest in understanding designs and methods that allow us to better answer the questions that we want to ask. So I've spent the last few years thinking a lot about complex systems methods and then also mixed methods. I'm also the former director of the UNLV Center for Research Evaluation and Assessment, where we engaged in quite a bit of work using complex systems methods and mixed methods to understand and evaluate large-scale research centers and collaborations. My work has been funded by the National Science Foundation in the United States, and I've also collaborated with others on funding through the National Institutes of General Medical Sciences and the state of Nevada. So let's see. So a little bit about my history with complex systems and why I think I'm here today. I do hold a doctorate in systems science with a focus on psychology, and that was an interdisciplinary program. And I have to say that it was incredibly formative, being able to learn from others different in business and sociology and public policy and public health, and think about how the problems that we face are often involved and are better solved by people that are coming at these issues from a variety of different perspectives. And I do have to say, in the last 5 years or so, I've been working really closely with Dr. Jonathan Hilpert, and all of the ideas that I am presenting here today are jointly developed. So there will be many times that you hear me referring to we and our. This is not because I'm engaging in some kind of royal we, and I want to talk about myself in the third person. It really is because I feel as if most of these ideas are not mine alone and have emerged from that collaboration. So this is just as much his talk as it is mine. I also, as I mentioned before, in my methods work, I've spent my focus on design has really been deeply engaged with thinking about how we can capture context and also how we can think about the granularity of properties across different levels of the system. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then my empirical work in complexity and complex systems perspectives spans things from like state-space analyses of engagement states in classrooms, school mobility, collaborative engagement and research, and thinking about how different the same phenomena might be differently represented at different levels of phenomena and how we measure those. So most of my examples today are going to be from the field of education because that's where I've spent the last 13 or 14 years of my career. But I have done some work in health-related research and other spaces, so I'd be happy to talk with anyone at another time around that space. Okay, so to my next slide. So today I'm going to talk about my own complexity perspective, what I think has contributed to the movement towards complexity in behavioral and social sciences, what I think some of these ideas mean for behavior change research, and what are the key elements to consider in CS research designs, methods, and analyses. And then I will provide a brief example of what this might look like in practice. So bear with me, I'm going to go through quite a few ideas, and I'm really grateful to Nellie in particular and my other presenters for covering these topics in much greater detail than I probably will today. Okay, my little down button's not working. That's why you see me looking confused every now and then. Okay, so when I start thinking about this, and I'd ask you to engage in this thought with me, which is thinking about what the nature of the problems are that we face in society that require intervention and that we bring to bear issues of what types of behaviors we would like to change. And many of the problems that society face in healthcare, education, public service, and the like do not lend themselves to simple solutions due to the very nature of their problems. So our issues are ill-structured, ill-defined, they're multi-level, they're multi-causal, and they're characterized by nonlinear behaviors that are steeped in history that often obscures the true identification of what we might think of as an initial condition or how it started. We also find that there are limits to action possibilities for addressing these problems that are derived from conditions that are external to the problem itself. So problems and their interventions can be located with the individual at the center of the problem space. They could be located within a group of various sizes or in different organizations and structures, such as a family or community or a broader societal structures. So, my computer seems to, there we go. They're all going to bounce away like we wish we could make our problems bounce away. But I have this comic strip up here because given sort of the obviously overwhelming and somewhat incomprehensible nature of that type of statement, we're often left with responses that range from apathy to deconstruction, where we want to simplify and sort of take apart a problem and tackle it one piece at a time, to attempts to develop large-scale, complicated, and comprehensive interventions. And regardless of the nature of the response, when policies and practice are developed and designed to address complex phenomena, the conceptualization of the research to follow these and identify intervention effectiveness and outcomes are rarely rooted in complexity approaches. So our contribution is not to try to solve complex issues and problems of society, but to pragmatically address the research contributing to the evidence base around complex phenomena, be these personal, group, or societal challenges, issues, problems, or just downright mysteries. And this is a slow turn of the wheel. We are in the questioning phase of complexity science and social and behavioral realms. We're seeking answers, we're sharing information, and we're not always sure how to move forward. So this comic strip, where I take a lot of my philosophy and orientation towards life from Calvin, is representative of what many of us have done over the years when we're faced with the recognition that our conceptual understanding of complex issues and phenomena aren't really matched by the models we use to represent them and the methods that we use to investigate them. We ignore the evidence and we cleave to our traditions. But through these type of symposia and conversations, I believe that we can find a way for complexity, perspectives, and research to rise among the existing frameworks that have traditionally guided our work. And in this way, complex systems work can provide another complementary source of information on which to base our decisions. Okay, so what is our complexity perspective? How am I coming to this? So when referring to complexity approaches, scholars include a set of loosely related theories, models, perspectives, and frameworks. There's not a single way to do complexity science. And all of these share common ideas about the interactive architecture of the world and its development. So although these perspectives diverge in terminology, focus, and method, what makes CS approaches distinct is a focus on the interactive nature of the system. So I've circled in red just a few of the perspectives that most closely align with our own and from which we draw upon for our own work in complex systems. So this is a really lovely map that Brian Castellani put together where he's brought all of these different ideas and put them in a way that allows us to kind of get an idea of the overwhelmingly diverse way that we think about complex systems in our different fields. So complex systems approaches provide researchers with a framework for studying these collections of interacting elements that by virtue of their interactions produce emergent system-wide behavior. So complex systems perspectives require a fundamental shift in the way that scholars and decision makers conceptualize the phenomena that we're trying to change. So approaching behavior change from a complexity perspective requires consideration of the phenomena themselves as complex systems, which Melanie Mitchell in her excellent book on complexity defined as collections of interacting elements that give rise to emergent behavior. So hallmarks of complex systems approaches to research in the social sciences include a focus on systems architecture, or what are the different levels of the individual and social systems, as well as systems behavior, which includes the stability and change in human behavior and the transactions that occur amongst the different levels in the system. So in our work, we've established an ontological framework that defines the complex macro behavior of the systems, the dynamic micro interactions of systems components, and the emergent mechanisms that produce systems outcomes. So I'm just going to talk briefly about each one of those pieces, just to give you an idea of where I'm coming from. There is a plethora of systems concepts that are extremely relevant to the work that we do. And I believe that other presenters will be touching on those more specifically in some of their really excellent presentations. But I'm just going to talk kind of big picture here. So the principle of complexity refers to that macro behavior of the system. And the underlying system, the underlying structure of a system is typically a network. So in this figure, you see down at the base level, you see a bunch of nodes, and then you see lines connecting the little circles, which are, the little circles are nodes, and the lines are considered edges in network science. But we're using this to represent the idea that at the lower levels of the system, we usually have these interactions. And although there are many definitions of complexity, they typically involve both the networked nature of the strong interaction within and between those systems components, between those nodes, as well as the nested nature of the system as a whole. So nested interaction dominant systems are more complex. So the architecture of systems is often the subject of discussion, where we're referring to the levels of the system and the degree of hierarchy. So complex systems are composed of subsystems, which in and of themselves are composed of subsystems, and so on. So you kind of can drill down, and you can look up depending on where you're standing in the system. But the basic idea is that the systems are composed of building blocks, but each building block can evolve or develop into new adaptive states to become a new building block, and the combination of which becomes another larger subsystem. When we think about dynamics, so when we think about how these elements or these little components have interdependent relationships, we're talking about dynamics within systems. So dynamics describe the microprocesses by which the different component parts of complex systems interact over time, both amongst themselves and in conjunction with the overall macro system behavior of the system. In dynamic microprocesses, the elements of the system change together through interaction, and they change each other. As component parts interact, a dependency amongst the components is created so that the behavior of the individual components, those lower level micro interactions, is constrained by the actions of the other components. So the system behavior is partly governed by a bottom-up process that may look different at distinct points in time as those different parts organize and reorganize in a non-linear fashion through self-organizing processes. So the behavior of that system can be sudden or gradual, depending on mutually reinforcing processes that are internal to the system, so what's happening inside the system, as well as pressures exerted on those processes from external forces or contextual forces. So adaptive systems require some sort of balance between order and chaos, and we can view adaptive behavior of these dynamic systems by thinking about concepts such as attractor states. So an attractor state, and I'll talk about that later on, so it's an important concept here, is a tendency for a system to settle into a stable pattern. And it's a way of describing homeostasis, where the stability of a system is maintained through a series of continual adjustments to internal or external perturbations of that behavior of that system. And so a lot of times we use, when we're trying to model dynamics, we use time series data to map state spaces, or to map a conceptual space that provides all possible values for the system behavior, and it demonstrates where the values are most likely to occur. Finally, we can think about emergence. So emergence is the mechanism by which dynamic micro-interactions of system components give rise to novel macro system behavior. So it's how it happens, how does change occur? In his excellent work on emergence, Sawyer argued that complex systems with emergent mechanisms produce multiply realizable complex macro constructs. It's a lot of words via wildly disjunctive dynamic micro interactions. So what does that mean? It means that the dynamic micro interactions combine in different ways at different time points, and depending on how they combine and how they are mutually reinforcing each other, the macro behavior that may emerge from those interactions may be a little bit different. And there's multiple ways or multiple realizations of the way that what that behavior looks like. So it's impossible to define all combinations of the components that produce identifiable macro states of systems. So when we're talking about complexity perspective, we're defining not just the architecture of the system as complex, but also the nature of the behavior produced by that system. So research about the individual and so on may be rooted in complex systems approaches to more accurately describe the behavior itself, which leads us to want to redefine behavior and how we think about behavior for behavioral and social sciences. We're talking about patterns. This is a story about patterns. We're not defining a thing, we're defining an action. Actually, we're defining an interaction, to be more precise, with behaviors that shift depending on the dependencies amongst the many factors or elements within the system. And so these, even though there's dozens of different concepts related to architecture and behavior that are beyond the scope of what I'm going to talk about today, these basic concepts are critical for our discussion because it requires us to think differently about phenomena themselves, which then in turn will lead us hopefully to think differently about how we research them. So why? So this is, complexity approaches are not necessarily easy to wrap your head around, and especially when you're a researcher and you haven't received much training in complexity approaches in your graduate program, thinking about where to start and why we're kind of at the point where there's this particular symposia focused on complexity and behavior intervention and behavior change. This is a movement that we've seen some steam for in a variety of different fields. So what's contributed to the movement towards complexity and the behavioral and social sciences? We believe that there's convergence amongst three sources. The first is that there's an increased observation and recognition that many of our analytic models are a pale representation of the conceptual models that we believe match our theory around behavior change. The second is that there's an increase in a growing dissatisfaction and confusion with the current state of evidence stemming from randomized controlled trials and other traditional methods that we use to study our interventions and our evidence and gather evidence for our intervention effectiveness. The third is that there's evidence that many of our phenomena or study are not component dominant and therefore are mischaracterized in our statistical models. So this is kind of the notion that as especially mathematical approaches gain sophistication and social and behavioral sciences, we're improving our ability to find evidence that our models are mischaracterized. So let's talk about each one of those things. Okay, so this idea of mismatch between theory and method, I think, is really important. And this is where this is what we've been trying to convey to our own colleagues for the last couple of years. So if we imagine a phenomena that we're interested in studying and it fits the definition of that which is a complex phenomena, which I just described, we might think about all of the factors that influence that focal element of interest. So perhaps it's an individual. This can include social factors, personal and individual factors, history, broader socio-political and historical contexts, and so on. And then we can think about how those factors interact to influence each other and how those interactions unfold together over multiple time scales. Okay, so if you're trying to think about all of those different elements that are influencing your phenomena of interest, try to draw a conceptual model of this phenomena. It can be really challenging. So let's take an example. If we take a concept that's often the source of consternation for educators at the lower and upper education levels, which, if, for example, perceived bias against females in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, particularly physics, that contributes to females choosing alternative education and professional pathways. You might be interested in developing an intervention to retain females in STEM majors. To begin, you might develop a conceptual or theoretical model that includes individual factors such as motivation, self-concept of physics, identity, prior academic performance, interest, and so on. And then let's say you think that social partners have an influence on STEM persistence. So you add in peer quality, instructional support, and other factors that are part of the social relationships that we form in education. And then let's add gender norms in society and policies that privilege males in sciences. And in your conceptual model, you imagine that bias, and conversely persistence in physics, develops through a series of micro-interactions of the individual operating in context during task interactions, such that every time, for example, a student engages in a task, such as studying in a textbook, she might battle stereotypes about gender when she only sees pictures of men in her textbook. And she calls upon her beliefs, interests, and knowledge to complete the task, and she filters messages about her perceived ability when she asks questions of her peers and of her instructors. And through a series of these micro tasks, she develops a relatively stable self-concept about her physics self and a general orientation towards engagement or disengagement in the physics domain. So this is maybe your conceptual model. You've drawn this out, you've identified all of these different factors and how they're related to your topic. Now, how would you choose which element to target for an intervention? Do you target classroom messages? Do you target stereotype threats? Do you target her personal motivation? Do you target the tasks themselves? And once you decide on that, how do you develop a study to adequately control for all the non-manipulated variables so that you can isolate the effects of your intervention? Sloan and Wilkins describe this next step after you get through this conceptual model of developing a statistical model. And the conceptual and statistical models need to overlap and be aligned with existing theory to yield a useful research model. So imagine that you decide to next focus an intervention to strengthen physics identity. And so you create an intervention that exposes students to female physicists through a series of online lectures. And you have a control and an experimental condition to which students are randomly assigned. So let's say that your study yields a moderate effect with your sample, but it fails to replicate in other universities and other classrooms, and the relationships amongst physics identity and other variables is not consistent across studies. What happened? The reduction of the complex conceptual model to a testable statistical model often leads to a gap between theory and method. That is, and the model that it produces restricts our understanding and our theory refinement. So we believe that the translation of these interaction dominant theories to testable component dominant models, which I'll talk about in a moment, sacrifices those three fundamental ontological aspects of complex systems: that which is complex, that which is dynamic, and that which is emergent. So if you think of your own work in your own field and you extrapolate this exercise, how have you reduced your complex phenomena to make it manageable to study? And conversely, how have you then scaled up the findings from these reduced models to introduce interventions on a broader scale? What does the evidence tell you about your interventions? Do they replicate? What are your effect sizes? What types of interactions have you identified? What might it look like to approach your phenomena, to identify, develop, and test interventions if you defined and studied your phenomena as complex? if you interpreted your findings from a complexity perspective, if you maintain that alignment throughout the life cycle of your research, what could you learn that complements findings from a more traditional perspective? So these are the types of questions, and sorry, I got behind on my slides. And when we're talking about that relationship between the theoretical postulation, the building of our conceptual model, and then how we build a statistical model. The other thing that I think we're starting to see some convergence from, and that complements sort of where we're seeing the gaps between our conceptual and our statistical models, is the idea that there's some dissatisfaction and confusion with the current state of evidence that we're using to understand and interpret the meaning of our behavior change efforts. So scientists and statisticians have spent a considerable amount of energy, rightfully so, trying to determine which indices provide meaning to our research. So we've moved away from p-values as the sole proprietor of meaning towards effect sizes, which are a measure of how much impact an intervention has by comparing the amount of difference between groups, and it's not affected by sample size. But we've moved away and we've moved towards effect sizes, which has led to arguments over what is meaningful or large in real world settings. For example, a recent argument emerged when Danielle McNamara and her colleagues published a meta-analysis of growth mindset interventions, which are a hot topic in education research, finding that the average effect size for students with low achievement was about 0.19 of a standard deviation, and for all students about 0.08. This is a small effect. McNamara reported that the average effect size of education interventions is about 0.57, so a little bit more than half a standard deviation. Carol Dweck, the progenitor of the growth mindset movement, issued a response reinterpreting the average educational effect size assertions to be more closely approximated at 0.20 for studies including standardized tests or summative grades, citing the lack of rigorous evaluation of education interventions using achievement outcomes as calling into question the true measure of the large effect in education interventions. Maddie, who's part of this symposium, turned me on to a talk by Michael Sanders at the first BESP that provided a similar effect size critique, particularly when interventions are complex or designed to address complex issues. Gene Glass, arguably the father of meta-analysis, wrote in his commentary on 100 years of education research that the average effect size is only part of the story of intervention research. Trends in education research, which are not much different than other fields, suggest a continued trend for lowering the standards around what effect sizes are considered important, coming to a place where effects are increasingly difficult to detect in any other than the most restrictive environments and nearly impossible to replicate. The variability of effect sizes, usually a wide variability, tells a different story. This variability suggests that the comparisons of groups within an intervention depends heavily on the circumstances around the intervention or the experiment, which are often not detailed. The impact of interventions are often smaller than their variability. We just cannot reliably control the effects of time or context on the consistent production of effects on intervention. This type of observation led Stanley Palgrove recently, he wrote in The American Statistician, to propose turning to a different set of statistical criteria and practical benefit to determine the utility of an intervention for improving the functioning of complex organizations and interventions for change of complex processes. This criterion compares the unadjusted actual performance of an experimental group to an existing benchmark and then interprets this finding, taking the context within which the research was conducted into account, to determine if the intervention might have an impact on the desired or new context. So similar arguments are happening across the behavioral and social sciences and include conversations about replicability and generalization. And much like the conversation about effect size, the conversation tends to be less about criticizing existing statistics or experimental designs and more about the underlying assumptions about the applicability of such designs and the use of statistics in the first place for studying and intervening with multi-level complex processes that unfold on different timescales. Beyond the problems that we experience in naturalistic environments, what if we think about behavior differently? Why do we expect replications of specific findings of complex phenomena? My talk today and the work I've done with my colleague John Hilpert echoes these concerns and focuses on what might happen if we reconceptualize our topics, issues, and phenomena from a complexity perspective. And how do we engage in research processes that maintain that alignment amongst the conceptualization and method? And then if we take a CS perspective, how do we interpret our findings from our research? So I wanted to share a quotation from Stanley Pograw's article where he argued for improvement science as an approach to research and evaluation in complex organizations and topics. He stated, the only way to find some near optimal combination of implementation parameters is to embrace the reality that there is tremendous variation in school contexts, and to learn from the beginning how early prototypes are working or not working in various contexts, and then make needed adjustments on the fly. Such adjustments cannot be made without researchers becoming intimately knowledgeable about the many facets of different contexts that the intervention needs to be able to adapt to. As previously noted, such a focus on context has been noticeably lacking in more gold standard forms of research, and such an absence has led to a misunderstanding of the applicability of research findings. So drawing upon that idea about how we're mischaracterizing, that leads us to my third place where I think we're getting, which has led us to conversations around complexity in this space. And that is that traditional statistical methods used by behavioral and social scientists rest on assumptions that the underlying structure of a system consists of a stable set of components or elements that operate in predictable ways, and as such, outcomes can be nearly perfectly reduced to the sum of their parts. The relationships amongst components and component-dominant systems are relationships that are considered linear, meaning that the role of the components in the model and the strength and direction of the relationships are stable across time and context. This is a nomothetic process. The statistical methods that are common in our fields are ideal for examining component-dominant models, which assume independent, time-invariant relations. This perspective treats noise in the system as error to be controlled or ignored. In contrast, interaction-dominant systems assume that interdependence amongst the components of the system are the primary assembly mechanism for an outcome, and that these relations shift in strength over time. The elements and the ways that they relate may be unknowable, and as a result, the collection of variables that produce the outcome cannot be perfectly reduced to an empirically defined set that in total accounts for outcomes. So the relations amongst the system's component is interdependent and nonlinear, so that the variable roles and the strength and the direction of those relationships change over time and from context to context. So the linear statistical models that I'm talking about are often difficult, the assumptions of those are often difficult to meet, and in some cases, some assumptions, such as the one that the structure and strength of relations are stable over time, are rarely tested at all. So these ideas related to intervention are well articulated in a recent article by Wallet and Kelty-Stephen. These authors used research in cognitive science to highlight the prevalence of interaction effects required to predict an outcome. And then conversely, the inconsistency of the interactions of predicting the same outcome across different studies. They also find evidence for complexity from studies using time series data, such as the famous finger tapping study that found that observations are not independent from each other from time point to time point, but instead information from across an entire time series is required to predict observations at any point in the time series. So this 1F noise, as it's called, shows up when an event is not predicted only by its nearest neighbors, but by the time events on different time horizons. So why does this matter? It matters because it demonstrates the dynamic organization of systems behavior. So rather than some external or law-like control of the system by a higher order component, the dynamic interdependent relationships amongst the components are that which determines the behavior of the system. And importantly, changes in the behavior of the system, particularly sudden shifts, are not the result of a single element, but rather the result of dynamic interdependencies that happen throughout the history of the interactions. So evidence for nonlinear, dynamic, multifractal behavior calls into question assumptions that phenomena are component dominant. And if they are interaction dominant, how then do we design, conduct, and interpret research so that the interaction is the primary unit of interest? And so if we think about kind of this convergence, this is why we're here, but it also asks us to think about, okay, so if we're going to get to the point where we think that maybe complexity ideas have something to tell us about behavior change research, what is it? What is it that we need to pay attention to when we're designing, when we're thinking about how to study behavior change, and then even going to the point where we're trying to design interventions to change it? Okay. So I think the first element that has an implication for us is thinking about a shift in the focal unit to target interactions and where it is that we are going to be targeting our interventions. So we can ask, is the focal unit a person, a group, an organization, or is it really the interaction itself or a transaction? What would it look like to design research that focuses on the interdependencies taking place in the micro level interactions within a person or amongst people and groups? What is that intervention? So typically, we have a person and we are going to target our intervention at that person. If we consider that the focus is not on changing an outcome directly, but changing the way people interact around that outcome, what would that look like? So if I'm interested in increasing school safety, a traditional perspective might impose harsh sanctions on the individual perpetrating aggressive behavior, or even provide practice for that student to reframe his or her attributions of perceived aggressive behavior. From a CS perspective, I might instead have a couple individuals or multiple individuals. And I might focus on exposing aggressive students to opportunities to engage with multiple social partners in school in pro-social ways. Okay, so I might be focused on that interaction, changing the transactions that are happening in that network. I also might think about, oops, going forward, not backwards. I also might think about, okay, so these are individuals that are living and existing, that interaction between them is existing within a group. And so we also might need to think about how are the individuals then interacting with the higher order context or with groups. And so we might want to think that the intervention might need to occur at multiple interacting levels of the system. And that interventions may look different depending on the system level. For example, we might think about the same desired state as looking different depending on whether we're focused on the individual or the group. And the reciprocal interactions between levels may change the intervention relevant behavior at either or both levels. We also think about, I think this perspective has a great deal of implication related to considering the importance of context when we're understanding behavior change. So researchers have chosen to treat context, so sort of the environmental aspects of that in which our behavior is unfolding. We've chosen to treat this context in a variety of different ways. So some people have chosen to treat context as ignorable and failed to address it at all in theory or empirical research. Others have acknowledged context but treated it as inseparable from intrapsychic or interpersonal processes, and as such have left it unexamined in empirical research. Others have included context as a nuisance and tried to include its effects as control variables in empirical research. Others have added context as a separable unit of analysis, such as you would find in a multi-level statistical model that leverages the meaningful impact on individual outcomes. And then we're also starting to see a movement towards those that treat context as the focal or primary unit of studies, so that group level as the element that's truly important. But what the mathematics of complex systems makes abundantly clear is that nothing happens independently of context and culture. So moment-to-moment micro interactions are influenced by phenomena at macro timescales through the duration of the observational period. So this means that cultural experiences that happen more broadly over the course of the human experience are always shaping our learning and development, and that the quantitative and qualitative data that we collect to study it. So consider how CS models and approaches can serve as viable and important frameworks for investigating the lived experiences of individuals with diverse backgrounds. Rather than looking for group differences and using traditional methods to highlight differences, CS-grounded research focuses on the multiply influenced nature of phenomena and how patterns and systems behavior respond to internal and contextual tensions. So CS research provides an opportunity to investigate how activity patterns within and between members of different groups with different ideas and perspectives produce emergent reoccurring states that are more or less optimal. And further, how the definition of optimal depends on the immediate context-person relation and the broader social historical context. Researchers interested in these transactions might use CS approaches to understand how diverse systems respond to perturbations or interventions, such as contextual pressures or social change and unrest. So for example, we urge researchers to think of points of stress in the system as a perturbation or an intervention as a perturbation, and then use CS methods to identify if and why bifurcations in behavior, so divergence in behavior amongst individual behavioral, social, and cognitive adjustment occur for individuals with different backgrounds or from different groups. So such points of stress can be as mundane as a transition or as an extreme as an act of violence. CS approaches afford the opportunity to take those responses out of the individual and consider how the transactions of the individual in the environment before, during, and after that point of stress or the point of intervention may guide future development. So this is important because it helps us identify in these complex systems and that are existing in fluid environments. It helps us identify how a shared stressor, how what appears to be the same intervention or the same stress point can contribute to vastly different paths. So why do we get that in divergence? So I think this is critical to pay more attention to those contextual constraints and affordances when we are designing our intervention studies. Okay, so you have to bear with me here for a second. I lost my spot. Okay, so the next element that I think is truly important is it helps us think a little bit differently about the evidence for stability and change in our studies. So change over time within different levels of a system can occur at different timescales. So for example, individual change may be faster than social change. So different timescales may be required at different levels to understand complex system behavior. And timescales have two fundamental properties. They differentiate the temporal continuum into units of different size that can be used to determine observation and aggregation intervals, and they also either have a socially constructed or objectively determined nature. So if we think about changes, if we focus on timescales and we focus about how they're related to change in human learning and development and human systems, we can think about everything from the large evolutionary timescale to individual timescales for the development of our processes. And a CS perspective inherently addresses temporality and change in systems through this emphasis on dynamic processes. So questions about stability and change should be central for thinking about intervention, design, and research. These include questions related to stability and measurement over time and across groups, questions related to within-person change and constructs, questions about correspondence amongst units of analysis over time, and questions about factors that constrain or predict change at different levels of analysis. So if we do not assume linear change, then we do not assume that there is an uninterrupted process between measurement points, we may get a different picture about how our interventions develop over time. So for example, if I'm taking a study that I did with some colleagues on self-efficacy and student engagement. So if we want to think about behaviors that self-organize and behaviors that are based on dynamics amongst components and forces external to the system, and we want to represent those in a different way, we might typically try, even if we collect data at multiple time points, it might look something like this, where our measures are bouncing around all over the place. But we often try to then fit a curve that would fit in there. And you could put a range of linear curves in here or linear lines in here, and none of them would be a particularly good fit. Similarly, we might represent the effect as some sort of aggregate or average post-test type of measure. And instead, we can think about, instead of representing data in this way, if we take a complexity science approach, perhaps I instead think about the way that self-efficacy and engagement coexist during the period of study, so during that post-test study. And I might find, for example, that the blue in that state space grid represents students that are had higher performance before the intervention, and the green represents students that had lower performance before the intervention. I might find that that my intervention is in kind of the formation or getting into an attractor state, which is kind of up here in the top quadrant. We might find that the cell range and dispersion where students spend their time is more narrow for students with higher pre-performance in math. And then I might also find that the grid then behaves better, or it corresponds to the theoretically defined attractors more consistently for higher performers. And so this gives me a really different picture than just kind of an average indicator of effect or an aggregate measure of an outcome. If I can look to see how is this working for whom, and it might even call into question my theoretical assumptions around the way that my key variables are related over time. Okay, so I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go quickly through the remainder of my pieces here, and I think that's fine. But so what does that look like then for our research questions? So, and our methods and our analyses. So research questions that are multi-level or multi-time scaled in nature, that are integrative across levels and address stability and change are key to setting up a study that can adequately be addressed through CS approaches. So we ascribe to the idea that what to target for research is often use inspired. By that we mean that what matters for any given project is what is intended for its use by stakeholders, whether they be other researchers, practitioners, policymakers, or someone else. So those intentions need to fall into the feasibility limits of any given study. So from a use-inspired perspective, researchers need to make informed choices about variables that span levels of analysis, time, and context in order to meet research goals and feasibility requirements. And to retain the ontological properties of complex system so that we maintain that alignment across theory and method, our research questions often point to intensive approaches to design and method. And we categorize those into time-intensive, relation-intensive, and time-relation-intensive data. So time-intensive approaches are used to make inferences about systems behavior using closely spaced observations over time. Relation-intensive approaches are used to make inferences about the system behavior using measures of the dependent relationships amongst variables. And time relation-intensive approaches are used to make inferences about systems behavior using closely spaced, simultaneously collected observations of both within element change and changes between element relationships. And ultimately, the use of those types of intensive data structures allow us to take a look at dynamic change over time and the interdependence of the relationships within the system. But even though I've drawn on more quantitative types of language throughout this talk, the methodologies that we bring to bear for studying complex systems can be and are diverse. So they can be post-positivist in nature, they can be interpretive, they can take critical lenses, and the methods and analyses are also very mixed. So for example, we can look at quantitative, qualitative, or mixed and multi-methods. So mixed methods are particularly well suited for addressing research grounded in complex systems, and the architectural and behavioral aspects of complex systems and the interplay between them may be best investigated by different methods. So for instance, identifying points of perturbation or intervention in systems when bifurcations are likely to occur, such as transition periods, might be best studied and used time-intensive quantitative methods, but describing the contextual affordances and constraints for arriving at new attractor states following a bifurcation might lend itself best to qualitative inquiry. And the integration across those two strands provide insights into system functioning that couldn't be gleaned by a single method. So I'd encourage you to look into emerging formulations of mixed methods, multi-level mixed methods that have been proposed to explicitly address complexities inherent in nested dynamic systems. Quantitative research methods are, of course, also a critical component of CS methodologies, and these have been lumped, Bar-Yam has lumped these into two primary categories, simulation-based and equation-based techniques. Equation-based techniques are most readily adopted in social and behavioral sciences, and they can include nonlinear modeling techniques, as well as other forms of time series analyses, including recurrence quantification analysis and orbital decomposition. We look at network analysis to look at the relation-intensive data, as well as other graphical forms of modeling, such as state space grids, which I just showed you an example of. And then, of course, qualitative researchers have been doing this work really well for a long time. And it's been a fruitful source of information about complex systems, particularly when investigating how actors' lived experiences are shaped by transactions with multiple elements of the nested systems in which they're embedded. So case study is a commonly applied design and complexity of real-world phenomenology is also very helpful, and we can define the system and then leverage our qualitative techniques such as interviews and observations to identify and describe interactions of the individual within different levels of the system and how those change over time to influence that in a way that influences the meaning that the individual describes to their experience. Okay, so very briefly, I was going to spend some time talking a little bit more about a networked model of school mobility to give you an idea of how taking a CS approach can be helpful to identify intervention points. So if you're not sure where to start, using CS methods might point you in a different direction than a more traditional conceptualizations of interventions. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I'm happy to share these slides later if anyone is interested. But the basic idea is that when we have a traditional perspective on school mobility, we usually describe mobility or changes in schools as a brief independent event. So it's a single, it's usually lives in the person. There is a range of demographics that we associate with increased mobility, and there is a range of outcomes. From a complex systems perspective, we can look at social factors that are difficult to separate, and they might exist at multiple levels. So mobility is often influenced by school choices, family decisions, economic factors, and so on. And it's really difficult to sort of disentangle those to come to a solution. And so we decided to think about representing mobility as a complex system. And what we did is we took a multi-nodal social network approach. So we looked at the reoccurring patterns and emergent properties of student transitions amongst schools. And we looked at the network of students in schools to represent the dynamic flow within the system. So anytime you're looking at networks, you're exchanging something. There is exchange of energy or information. What we have in this perspective is that we believed that we could think about mobility as exchange among schools, and then the focal unit becomes the transition itself instead of the individual or the school. And so we transitioned what is typically a nested type of approach. So enrollment instances are nested within students, and students are nested within multiple schools or cross-classified. And instead we thought about what would this look like if we treated the transition itself, the change between schools, as a type of exchange. And when we did that, we created a network of about 186 elementary schools that yielded almost 15,000 school transitions and represented almost 35,000 school dyads. And by doing this, we were able to identify that there are different clusters of schools that are exchanging students more regularly than others. So what you're seeing over here is a brokerage analysis of the coordinator of how schools are exchanging students. And what we found is that schools that are low or high poverty schools have a tendency just to shuttle students around within them or between them, and that's not terribly surprising. But even when students are able to gain access to schools in more affluent areas, they're usually sent back to lower performing schools that have a higher concentration of students living in poverty. And so if we were going to think about an intervention using this approach, instead of focusing on the student or a single school, the unit for the intervention might be the school clusters in addition to or rather than the individual student. And we can think about how we might develop interventions related to school services, school quality, try to focus on neighborhood challenges where we might find clusters where kids are kind of transitioning amongst schools to try to help stabilize the educational experience for those students. All right, so that's a lot, but I think that it's helpful to consider what it might look like if we are going to be using this type of approach. Okay, so I apologize, I went a little bit long. Natty may and Nellie may cut me off when they get to this point, but I just wanted to close with kind of a personal note. So on a final note, when I was working on this talk, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a Supreme Court Justice in the United States, passed away, and the US lost a woman of integrity and principle who guided brave and pragmatic thinking in a time where her positions were often viewed as disruptive and sometimes dangerous. And I think perhaps we need a little dangerous and different thinking right now. Her loss left me thinking about the act of thinking differently, about how creativity and perturbations of a system can lead to watershed changes, and about how it's rarely possible to see the effects of those perturbations from within the moment that leads to the emergence of new states for complex systems, and how it is critical to consider how affordances and constraints offered by the context in which the system operates places parameters around the reach of systems change and the possible states where behavior may or may not come to rest. And I'm hopeful that in this confusing and uncertain time that we're living within is such a time when there's an unusual confluence of contextual factors signaling a period that is open for change. And I'm also hopeful that although we cannot forecast clearly the eventual outcomes of the perturbations that are happening in our social, political, and health systems right now, we can make choices that constrain our action possibilities to those that are healthy for our people and supportive of reform. Because complexity thinking is about recognizing patterns, and indeed, sometimes small changes in behavior can lead to powerful systems change. So thank you for listening, and I would like to thank the organizers of the 5th BESP for the invitation and the Finnish Cultural Foundation for funding. And special thanks to Nellie, Maddie, and Sarmite, who helped quite a bit as I engaged with my questions related to this presentation. I hope to see you all soon, and please contact me with questions or any other comments. Have a great conference.